Our first reflection, the Passover and freedom. You may remember Abraham and Sarah's grandson, Jacob, and his 12 sons and their families and retinue moved to Egypt in a time of famine. Jacob's name had been changed now to Israel, meaning he wrestled, because Jacob had wrestled with God. Israel and his sons entered Egypt in this time of famine because Israel's 11th son, Joseph, had become a high administrator in Pharaoh's kingdom. And he was managing the famine, the abundance and then the famine that struck. They stayed there a long time because they were comfortable, and they ended up being enslaved in Egypt. And some 400 years later, there was born a child named Moses, raised in Pharaoh's house. And Pharaoh and his sister Miriam, who was possibly the real hero, and Aaron, they led the people to freedom. We call that the Exodus. They escaped slavery. It's a lovely story to read, but on the night before they left, Moses had said to them, God has asked you to sacrifice a lamb and put the blood of the lamb on the lintel and the doorposts, so that the angel of death, when it passes by, will pass over your house and only strike the Egyptians. Whatever actually happened there, obviously it was traumatic, it was a struggle, but they were finally released from slavery. They were almost driven out, the Israelites, with other people, slaves as well. But they remembered that night. They remembered that day of freedom. And they called it the Passover. And every Jew up to today still, they remember the Passover. It was a day of freedom, a day of new release and life. And they tell the story again, how God had led them out of slavery and how God will lead them, continue to lead them. We tend to think of Jesus, or we can, and some people do, of wandering about as a rabbi or teacher who somehow got caught up in a political system of the day and ended being crucified. But it was not haphazard. In fact, Jesus intentionally, carefully orchestrated his last earthly days. We understand Jesus of Nazareth was in his 3rd year of ministry. This year, he went up to Jerusalem at the Passover time. He enters Jerusalem on the first day of the week. And during the Passover week, on the first day, that was the day a household would go and buy a lamb to be sacrificed, and the flesh eaten, and the sacrifice and the blood given up to God. And Jesus on that day enters Jerusalem. The action of Jesus begs the question, was he aligning himself with the Passover lamb? Anyway, during that week, events build up. He confronts people in the temple, and he finally sends his disciples off because he already arranged a room where he will share the Passover meal with his disciples, or the pre-Passover meal. Time fractions are getting a little hazy here in the scripture. But Jesus sits down with his disciples and shares what we understand to be a Passover meal. And during that reading, we have a sense of what Luke's saying here is that Jesus took not a cup. The other gospel writers say a cup. But he says initially Jesus took a cup and he shared it with his disciples. Then they broke bread, and then they finished what is supper. And in the Passover meal, there's a period where they eat together. And that is bookended by 2 cups, or 2 cups are drunk there of wine, special cups. And then there's a 3rd cup and a 4th cup. So what we find in the Passover meal are 4 cups drunk. And they are based on a promise that God makes to Moses in Exodus chapter 6, verse 6 to 8. God says, and this is the 1st cup, I will free you from the burden of slavery. And the 2nd cup is, I will deliver you from slavery. And the 3rd cup is, I will redeem you with an outstretched arm. And the 4th cup, I will take you as my people. It is a beautiful expression, expressed as a stanza, poetically. But the Jewish people, when they celebrate Passover, have those 4 cups. The first 2 are taken during a meal, and they come to the 3rd cup. Now, Luke is the only one who suggests which cup it is. We can assume that the people who first read the Gospels were people who knew Jesus or knew the disciples, and they were Jews too. So they knew how the Passover went, the cups. But it seems that Jesus, Luke says to us, took the cup of redemption, the 3rd cup. He took that cup. And he says these words, this is the new covenant in my blood. That's a profound statement. It's also heretical, because only God can redeem. So what is he saying? And his blood? Likening it to the Passover lamb? This is possibly the one place where Jesus is saying very clearly to his disciples, I'm the Messiah. I'm the one. I'm sure those disciples were struggling to understand fully, and it's quite clear that their understanding of Jesus, they knew when they were with Jesus, and I put it this way, that when they looked into his eyes, they felt they were looking into the eyes of God. When they heard him speak, they felt they were listening to the voice of God. When they felt his touch, they had a sense that God had touched them. And this seemed to be a confirmation. So when we come to our Holy Communion, this cup is representative. It is a symbol of that taking the 3rd cup and Jesus saying, this is the new covenant, or the newer covenant in my blood. The covenant has never really changed. God has promised to bless us. But that many covenants, it was renewed and renewed. And Jeremiah tells us that God would one day write a new covenant in our hearts. And it seems that Jesus is doing this as we read Luke's Gospel and we read the Newer Testament, or the Newer Testament. This is an amazing thing that Jesus is doing, claiming. And in terms of Orthodox Judaism, it's heretical. Each of the four Gospels have reference to the Passover meal Jesus shared with his disciples. And it's in that tradition that is passed on to his disciples and is part of the newer covenant, this expression of a covenant between God and us, of grace, of love given, and the pathway to God seemingly given through this man, Jesus of Nazareth, who those first disciples began to understand, and the churches followed that understanding, that Jesus was God with us, the Christ, the Messiah. Here, Paul reminds the Corinthian church of how to conduct a communion service, as we call it, or a Eucharist, as in some churches. And in this framework that Paul is giving, which actually is virtually the words of the four Gospels, he reminds us of some important truths. The bread is likened to Jesus' body, Jesus' being, his teaching, his life, his example to us. And we take it as a reminder that Jesus is the one we follow, and that we need to feed on him, so to speak, in the sense of learn of him, understand, walk in Jesus' ways. And we take it as a reminder that we are people in need of support and encouragement and learning about Jesus, and also learning what it is to love another. And we take it together in this assembly as an indication of our unity. Unity of will, not necessarily of mind. The will that we are here to serve the Lord Christ, to serve God, to love God and love our neighbor. And so together, as we take it together, we are reminded that we are learners, disciples. We are people in need. And we are, as one missionary once said, it's just another one beggar showing another beggar where to find bread. And that is our purpose, deep purpose, the unity of purpose that we have as Christians. Loving God and loving our neighbor. The lamb sacrificed reminds us that the loving God has first and always will and always does pave the way to God's presence. God invites us. We can't find it. It's not because we have achieved this or achieved that, but God brings us. God brings us to this table. God brings us to God's presence. It's an invitation. And the symbolism and the action of Jesus, the giving of his life, and all that may mean, and how we try and explain it and understand it in so many different ways, bears a simple truth that this is a pathway into the very presence of God and the light that shows us which way to walk in life. So in a moment we will say the great prayer of thanksgiving, and we say and celebrate this sacrament in our church. We celebrate it in the light that we stand in this long tradition that goes back to the Exodus.